A young woman traveled to another city for an art exhibition and vanished without a trace. When the police got involved, they managed to find a few disturbing clues, but these didn't bring them any closer to solving the mystery. This went on for 50 long years, until detectives finally uncovered the unexpected truth, and the facts of the case were at last brought to light. Mary Kathleen Schlais was born on November 11, 1949, in the American town of Champlin, Minnesota. She grew up in a large family and had a passion for creativity from a very young age. Mary loved to draw, and in her school years, she decided to dedicate her life to art. To pursue this, she enrolled at the University of Minnesota, where she studied fine arts and created sculptures. All of her professors noted that she had a genuine talent and a bright future ahead of her. Thanks to her academic success, she received several scholarships during her studies. Mary also frequently showcased her work at various exhibitions, which was a significant achievement for her. In addition to this, she studied abroad for a time, becoming fluent in German and Danish, and also began learning Japanese. After graduating, Mary continued to create art and travel. Since painting didn't bring in much money, she lived a modest life and tried to be frugal. She rented an apartment with a friend and preferred to hitchhike between cities and states. This was a fairly popular way to travel, as public transportation was not well developed. Often, people without a car either couldn't get to another city at all, or buses ran very infrequently. Besides, back in the 70s, hitchhiking didn't have the negative reputation associated with disappearances and tragic events, as news of such incidents didn't spread as quickly as it does today. On February 15, 1974, when Mary was 25, she was planning to go to an exhibition in Chicago. The journey from Minneapolis was about 400 miles, so she planned to cover the distance in stages. Mary intended to hitchhike to a city called Madison, Wisconsin, and then head to Chicago from there. Around 10:30 a.m., she left her home with a sign that read Madison and headed towards the highway. 3 hours later, a man named Dennis was driving down a country road in the neighboring state of Wisconsin. At one point, he turned onto a long dead-end road and saw a parked car with two people standing next to it, a man and a woman. As he drove by, he thought he saw some kind of argument or fight happening between them, but he wasn't entirely sure if he had understood the situation correctly, so he kept driving. However, what he saw bothered him. A few minutes later, he reached the end of the road and turned back, but by the time he returned to the same spot, the car was gone. Nevertheless, Dennis noticed something unusual in the snow on the side of the road and realized a person was lying there. Without getting out of his car, he rushed home and told his wife what he'd seen. He then called his neighbor, and they went back to the location together. When they arrived, the men realized it was indeed a human body. It was a young woman, and there were signs of injury on her clothing. They immediately drove to the nearest house and called the police. Officers arrived at the scene and confirmed that the woman was no longer alive. Her body had multiple stab wounds. However, it appeared that her life had been taken somewhere else, as there was very little evidence at the scene. Near the body, police found a man's hat, which they believed might have belonged to the assailant. Forensic experts tried to make casts of the tire tracks left by the perpetrator's car, but the snow prevented the special solution from setting properly. No other clues could be found, and the body was sent to medical examiners for analysis. While waiting for the report, the police spoke with the only witness, Dennis, hoping to get some leads. According to his account, Dennis saw a thin white male, between 25 and 35 years old, about 5 feet 9 inches, 174 centimeters, tall, with light brown hair. As for the car, it was a small gold-colored sedan, but Dennis couldn't recall the license plate or model. Meanwhile, medical examiners determined that the victim had sustained about 15 stab wounds and had died from blood loss. They also found numerous defensive wounds, indicating that she had tried to fight off her attacker. The examiners found no evidence of assault, which ruled out the most obvious motive. While examining the body, they were also able to identify the deceased. It was Mary. After speaking with her roommate, the police learned that Mary had been planning to visit an exhibition in another city. The roommate also told them that Mary had taken her purse with her, but it was not found at the scene. Given that she left home around 10:30 a.m. and her body was found by the witness 3 hours later, detectives got a rough timeline of events. The drive from her home to where her body was found took about an hour and a half, meaning there was a high probability that Mary fell victim to the person who picked her up in Minneapolis. Police created a composite sketch of the suspect and distributed it to newspapers, hoping someone might recognize him. They received a few tips, but none of them brought investigators any closer to finding the person responsible. At the same time, detectives began to consider Dennis as a person of interest. for several reasons. First, they knew he had been on that dead-end road, but no one else had seen the other person he described. Second, his own story about that day raised reasonable doubts. According to Dennis, he had gone to a store that morning, but on his way home, he decided to just drive around for a while. His explanation for this was rather strange. He said his dog was in the car with him, and he thought the dog wanted to go for a ride. This raised serious questions, as did the fact that he had inexplicably turned onto a dead-end road that almost no one used. Another suspicious factor was his behavior. When Dennis found the body, he didn't get out of his car. Instead, he drove home to bring his neighbor back to the scene with him. While at home, he didn't feel the need to call the police, only doing so after his neighbor had also seen the body. It was possible Dennis was trying to create an alibi for himself and divert suspicion. However, there were also facts that contradicted the theory of his involvement. First, there were indeed tire tracks on the road that did not match his car. Still, detectives considered that another vehicle could have simply driven there before the incident. Second, the police could find no proof that Dennis was in Minneapolis that morning, meaning he wouldn't have had the opportunity to pick Mary up. But this could be explained if Mary had left the city with a different driver and then switched to Dennis's car. Police continued to question the man, but he stuck to his story. At one point, they even brought in a hypnotist who tried twice to put Dennis under hypnosis to extract additional information, but both attempts were unsuccessful. Interestingly, one of the tips the police received was an anonymous letter urging them to investigate Dennis's possible involvement more thoroughly, but the sender provided no additional details. With no progress on Dennis, investigators began looking for other possible suspects. They came across an unsolved case from 2 years prior. In 1972, a young woman named Jolie from Minneapolis decided to hitchhike home, and 15 hours later, her body was found near a river on the outskirts of the city. Detectives were interested in a possible link between these tragedies, as the two cases had some things in common. Jolie's friends had seen her get into a gold-colored car driven by a young man. This matched the color of the car Dennis had described. Furthermore, there were no signs of assault on her body, just like in Mary's case. But despite the clear similarities between these events, the detectives on Jolie's case also had no solid leads, so they couldn't help their colleagues. The police tried to find some connection between the cases that might lead to a suspect, but their efforts were fruitless. Over the following months, detectives looked into various suspects, but none could be linked to Mary's demise. They also found several witnesses who claimed to have seen a man resembling the composite sketch in a gold sedan, but this information did not bring investigators any closer to solving the case. Eventually, it went cold, as detectives couldn't find a single new lead. In the following years, the case was reopened several times. In the early 80s, a theory emerged that a serial offender named Randall Woodfield might be behind the act. He had confessed to his involvement in 44 fatal incidents and was sentenced to life in prison. He primarily picked up his victims when they were hitchhiking, which was the main reason he was suspected in Mary's case. However, detectives working on his cases found no evidence to prove his guilt. Over many years, police checked hundreds of leads that took them to almost every state and even into Canada, but they still couldn't identify the person responsible. Over time, the story of Mary's tragic end became an urban legend, well known in the county where her body was found. Since the police were never able to solve this tragedy, these paranormal stories became much more famous and widespread, and many people never even knew that a real case stood behind all the ghost stories. In the early 2000s, when DNA analysis was already being actively used in forensics, detectives decided to try to find a genetic sample of the perpetrator among the existing evidence. Back in '74, medical examiners had found foreign tissue particles under Mary's fingernails, which most likely belonged to her assailant. They were still stored in an evidence locker, but experts were unable to extract a DNA sample from them. However, they had one more option: the hat found at the scene. It was also in storage and contained several short male hairs. After examining them, experts were able to obtain a partial DNA profile, but here too they ran into a problem. There were no matches in the FBI's database. Still, this at least ruled out several suspects, including the serial offender, as their samples were already in the system. The case stalled for several more years until late 2022, when detectives learned about a new DNA analysis method called genetic genealogy. Realizing this was their only chance to finally solve Mary's case, they reached out to a lab at the College of New Jersey that specialized in this kind of research, and they agreed to help. The experts took the partial DNA sample from the hair on the hat and got to work. The fact that the sample was incomplete made the task much more difficult, but eventually, they were able to zero in on a possible suspect. By searching public databases for potential relatives of the DNA donor, they identified one specific man who met all the criteria. All that was left for detectives was to obtain his DNA sample, so they went to speak with him. He agreed to provide a sample, but to the investigators' surprise, it didn't match. The experts then suggested that the perpetrator might be his cousin, so detectives went to him for a DNA sample. But once again, they were met with failure. This was all very strange, as both men were closely related to the assailant. The problem was, there were no other candidates in their family who could be the suspect. The experts then theorized that the perpetrator's biological parents might have given him up for adoption, which would explain the situation. They began to go through archival records to test this theory, and on November 4th, 2024, they finally found what they were looking for. According to the available records, a common relative of the two men could be 84-year-old John Miller. Detectives began looking into this man and learned he had a daughter. They went to speak with her, and she agreed to provide a DNA sample. The test results confirmed what the detectives had been hoping for. The hair from the hat at the scene belonged to this woman's father. And so, 50 years after the tragedy, investigators finally identified the person responsible for Mary's death. As soon as they received confirmation from the lab, the police went to his home. Almost immediately after the detectives told him about the DNA match, Miller calmly confessed to what he had done. According to him, on that day, he picked Mary up on the road and promised to take her to her destination. When they had driven out of the city, he began trying to persuade her to be intimate with him, but she refused. Miller then pulled out a knife and struck her several times, after which he drove to the dead-end road to hide the body in the snow. Miller also recounted that while he was getting the body out of the car, another man drove past. The perpetrator got scared and immediately left, leaving the body on the side of the road. The next day, Miller saw the news about what happened to Mary in the paper and breathed a sigh of relief when he read that the witness had described the wrong car color. Miller stated that he had a blue car in those years, not a gold one. Finally, he said that he didn't feel much emotion about what he had done and had barely even thought about it since. Miller also said he threw the weapon into a swamp near his house, but couldn't remember what he did with Mary's purse. When detectives asked if he was involved in any other similar incidents, Miller said no. According to him, he didn't even remember why he took Mary's life. After his confession, Miller was charged with her demise and placed in jail to await trial. However, he stated that he has no intention of going through a trial and will plead guilty immediately. According to Miller, he is ready to spend the rest of his days in prison and doesn't want to go through a long legal process. And so, detectives were finally able to solve this complicated case, even though the search for the truth took 5 decades. Given that Miller is now almost 85 years old, he is unlikely to live for long in prison. But despite that, a final chapter has been written in Mary's case. As for the passing of Jolie, his involvement seems unlikely, given that Miller owned a car of a completely different color at the time. He may indeed have no connection to that incident. Nevertheless, police are investigating his possible link to other cases, but so far, they have made no progress in that direction. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments, and don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it. I also recommend subscribing to our Telegram channel, where we post the most interesting, uncensored crime stories from around the world every day. Thanks for watching.